Supplying infrastructure is one of the most basic functions of government. All levels of government, federal, state, and local, build public infrastructure, such as roads and highways, schools and universities, water treatment systems, and parks and prisons and other public spaces and buildings. Within the state of California, the state government is responsible for a wide range of infrastructure responsibilities, including transportation, K-12 and university facilities, as well as the state courts and prisons, and many programs within environmental resources and protection, such as the Department of Water Resources and state parks. In addition to covering many programs, infrastructure is also an important part of the state's budget. We estimate that over the last decade, the state alone spent more than $100 billion on infrastructure, and that does not include the billions of dollars spent by the federal government and local governments on infrastructure within California. Despite this cost and its importance to the state's economy, the level of information on our infrastructure spending is minimal. The process for determining what gets spent and what projects get built is not very deliberative nor coordinated. Oftentimes, high priority projects do not have funding while less critical projects move forward. At the same time, we do not have sufficient data on how the state spends its infrastructure dollars, the conditions of our facilities, and our needs and what we will need to spend to build and maintain our infrastructure over the next 10 years. With this in mind, the Legislative Analyst Office recently released a report entitled A 10-Year Perspective, California Infrastructure Spending, which provides an overview of the state's infrastructure program. This report, completed by many analysts within our office, attempted to provide a comprehensive overview of the state's infrastructure program in order to provide a starting point for the legislature and other stakeholders to understand the state's infrastructure program, how the state spends its infrastructure dollars, some of the challenges facing the state's infrastructure, and some potential solutions to improve our infrastructure and reduce its cost in the future. Specifically, the report examines the state's infrastructure spending over the last 10 years to identify spending trends as well as some potential problems that the state faces in meeting its infrastructure needs. The report is divided into chapters that focus on some of the state's larger infrastructure programs, including transportation, K-12 education, higher education, resources, and the state's criminal justice system, namely the state's courts and prison system. In this webcast, however, I will focus on some of our larger findings related to the state's overall infrastructure program. When talking about infrastructure, one of the most basic considerations is what kind of infrastructure does the state build? The state's infrastructure program encompasses a wide variety of programs. This includes many state programs like the state's highways, the state's universities, as well as the state's prisons and parks. However, almost 60% of the state's infrastructure funding goes to infrastructure that is owned and operated by local governments, such as local streets and roads, K-12 school facilities, and local parks. As shown in the figure, over the last decade, about 40% of the state's infrastructure spending went to transportation programs. This is mostly for the state's highways and local streets and roads, although a smaller proportion also supported public transit and high-speed rail. The next largest category of funding was for K-12 school facilities, which is almost entirely state local assistance to school districts. On the other end, only 2% of the state's infrastructure spending supported the state's prisons and courts. This could change over the next decade as the legislature has recently authorized large new infrastructure programs in both the state's trial courts and the state's prisons. For the most part, the state's spending on infrastructure has been for programs that is supported over a number of decades, such as K-12 schools and the state's highways. However, within the last decade, the state has also taken on some new infrastructure responsibilities, such as the high-speed rail, the state's trial courts, and children's hospitals. So how does the state pay for all this infrastructure? The state supports its infrastructure either directly through general fund and special fund expenditures or through borrowing. Most of the state's direct spending on infrastructure, or pay-as-you-go spending, is through special funds, primarily in transportation, where fuel taxes and other user charges provide revenue for infrastructure. Over 60% of the state's infrastructure spending, however, is funded through borrowing with general obligation bonds or lease revenue bonds. The state's use of bonds has increased dramatically over the last decade as voters have authorized a large number of new general obligation bonds, and the legislature and the governor have authorized a few new large programs funded with lease revenue bonds. The principal cost for the state in borrowing is for the principal and interest payments on its debt, which is usually paid back over 25 to 30 years. With the majority of the state's infrastructure spending coming from bonds, the major effect on the state's budget is through its annual debt service payments to cover the infrastructure debt. Over the last decades, the state's infrastructure costs for debt service have nearly doubled, meaning the state is now spending a larger share of its budget on infrastructure debt service. As shown in the figure, the state currently spends about 6% of its general fund on infrastructure debt service costs. This is much higher than it has been in the past, when the state has traditionally spent less than 4 or 5% of its budget on debt service costs. Additionally, the state has many bonds that are authorized that have not yet been sold. As the state sells these bonds over the next few years, it is expected that the debt service's share of the general fund will increase even more, up to above 7%. However, even that 7% figure is probably conservative, as a number of programs have exhausted their bond funds and would need additional bond funds in order to fund new projects. For example, both K-12 and higher education have spent most of their existing bond authority, and most of the bond funds in transportation have already been committed to specific projects. So to the extent the state wanted to fund additional projects above those already approved, it would need to authorize even more bonds, which could push debt service's share of the general fund up to 8 or 9% of the budget. As we stress in the report, there is no one right level that the state should spend on infrastructure. It could be argued that the state should spend 10% of its general fund budget on infrastructure if that is a priority and a need. However, given the state's recent budget shortfalls, where the state is only spending 6% of its general fund on infrastructure debt service, it would be very difficult for the state to spend an even larger share of the budget on debt service and still be able to fund its other priorities and programs. As such, in our report, we highlight a number of policy options for the legislature to consider. Specifically, we suggest that the state consider a more coordinated approach to its infrastructure investments that prioritizes to the most critical areas in order to reduce costs and produce better outcomes. In each chapter, we provide some ideas on ways that the state could reduce its cost, reduce demand for new infrastructure, and prioritize its investments to the most critical areas. We also offer some ideas on new revenues that the state could use to fund its infrastructure. Adopting any of these strategies would be different from the way the state currently operates and represent difficult choices for the legislature and stakeholders to consider. We believe that by addressing some of these issues now, the state could better address its long-term infrastructure needs and avoid more difficult choices down the road.